Wow. Wow. That was awesome. All right. We got to talk about that case right now. And I don't want to talk about it alone, so we have a very special guest joining me right now, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, who's joining me for the whole morning, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, it's great to see you.
Hey, good to see you too, Jesse.
Wow. Okay. She took matters into her own hands. What's your reaction after seeing that?
Well, I don't know if it was my wife or daughter or anything. I would be their biggest cheerleader, to tell you the truth. And there's no place. I'm not even going to say in the current political environment. I'm just going to say there's no place in polite society for this. You know, who in the world does this sort of thing? In the South, we have a saying where, we'll say, well, that boy has no home training, and that's obviously what's going on here. But out and out, this is essentially a sexual assault that has taken place. My wife had seen this some time ago, or just the other day, and she had mentioned that if you watch very carefully, he doesn't just simply slap her on the bottom. He actually, his hand lingers in certain areas there for a moment, and I think that that's probably what incised her so much, or incensed her so much, just beyond the pale, man.
Okay, so this groper's been identified as 31-year-old Ryan Sherwinski, and he has been charged with sexual battery. I just want to understand what was going on in his mind. Like, what did he think was going to happen? Did he think he was going to try and pick her up? Did he just want to grab a squeeze because of how she's dressed? I mean, what goes on in somebody's mind who thinks this is okay?
Yeah, I don't know. It's akin to being around, kindergarten children, where you're having to define these very specific, basic boundaries. We don't touch one another, this sort of thing, and it's like there's no brakes on this guy. How do you think that you're going to get away with this in the world in which we live now? Because not only did she seek retribution, and I think kind of got it, not just what's going to happen relative to the courts, but in her physical actions. But this thing is viewed now on CCTV. I think that most people, they just walk around in this haze, like they're not aware of what's going on around them. They're completely disconnected, which is kind of ironic in the fact that they say that we live in the most connected age of all time.
And what's crazy is this must happen to her a lot, because she felt it, and not even a fraction of a second later, she grabbed the guy. She knew it wasn't like him just passing by and maybe bumped into her. She knew what this was. And you know what's interesting? She's a hero. I mean, like, everybody's been tagging her on social media. She doesn't want attention. She said, please stop tagging me in this. I know what happened. I understand. She goes, I was there. I don't want to relive it. And I don't want to do any interviews. What a woman this is. What a brave person to just, this isn't about, she just did what she had to do. And I think that's pretty remarkable for her, what kind of person she is.
I'd agree, Jesse. And, listen, one way or another in this world, boundaries will be set with you. Either the courts are going to do it, or individuals will take it into their own hands to set those boundaries.
You said it right, Joseph. You said it right. So we are going to switch gears here, because I could talk about this more, but we have to focus on really the main case of the day, the Marine murder case that I mentioned earlier. This Marine, Jonathan Price, who was gunned down in cold blood. The question became, who did this? Was it Quincinio Canada and Dewan Malazim, or was it two other individuals? Well, the best place to start from this is really the beginning. And the beginning of this whole case is when Megan Price, his wife, who was also shot, she was shot in the leg, made that 911 phone call. This 911 phone call will stay with you. I guarantee it. Let's play that for you right now. So I've covered this case a lot, and every time I hear that phone call, it still gets to me. I mean, that is moments after her husband was just gunned down and she was shot through the leg. But what do you think it's like being in that moment? So I want to bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, being in that moment, what is happening to her physically? I mean, the adrenaline's rushing. She's losing blood from the leg. Can you maybe explain physically what is going on as she's trying to make a phone call about what happened?
Yeah. Aren't you amazed at just how lucid she is?
I am actually.
That's what's so striking to me. Based upon everything that she's just endured, Jesse. This is to say that it's an understatement to say that it's a horrific set of circumstances. The fact that she has witnessed her husband just absolutely be brutalized from the initial attack to the shooting, and then to have this trauma set upon her. And remember, the entire time she's trying to get him to live. And the fact that she just has her senses about her at that moment in time, yeah, adrenaline is pumping. I have to think that that's the only reason that there's any level of lucidity to her statements to 911. It's mind-blowing. It's gut-wrenching to listen to. And this is another thing, we in crime scene investigation, death investigation, we always show up after the fact, and in court, you look at photographs after the fact. We kind of, talk about things in the terms of, well, it was like this. This is happening. All of this evidence is being, produced at this moment in time. Just the telephonically and everything that has just occurred relative to the trauma. She's in the midst of this maelstrom, and that's what just kind of drives it home for me. I'm with you, man. It impacts me every time I hear it.
That's so funny. I was thinking the exact same thing. I was thinking how this really is happening right at this moment. She's not a family member who was phoned hours later talking about her husband. She was there. She's recounting every second of it. And she was shot in the leg herself. And we are going to talk all about Megan Price, because when we come back, we are going to play you her testimony from court. And it is very, very difficult to listen to. We'll be right back after this. That's Megan Price describing the moment her husband was killed and the moment she was shot in the leg, recounting it for a jury and for the world to see. We broadcast it live here on Law and Crime. Let's bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, as I look at her, I can't help but think how lucky she is to be alive. To have a gunshot wound through the leg, that can be fatal, correct?
Yeah, it can be. And we found out later that this round actually clipped the large bone in her leg, which is the femur, and passed by some pretty vital areas relative to blood supply. We think about the femoral artery. And when someone is shot in the femur, one of the things that happens is that the bone itself becomes shrapnel sometimes. It will disintegrate the bone, and those little edges of bone are very, very, very lethal. They can clip vital vessels in there, and you can have someone literally bleed out. So that's why people will and can die from a gunshot wound to the leg. And as she is shot, it's excruciatingly painful.
Right.
Of course, she's got adrenaline pumping. But
I was going to ask you that. Does the adrenaline affect it in some way? We only have about 15 seconds, so I'm curious.
Sure. Yeah, it does. It does, and it overcomes kind of blood loss at that moment in time, which increases heart rate, which can actually increase the probability you might bleed out. So it's a dangerous cocktail.
It's a good thing that adrenaline was kicking. I mean, we can only hope. With no pain, and she did survive. But a little bit later, we are going to play you her testimony where she talks about how her life, the life that she had, is nowhere near the life she has today. And it's because of that bullet wound, and also because she lost her husband. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. You can't make that testimony up. That is as real gets. That is the wife of the Marine that was gunned down, and she's describing the injuries that she sustained. Let's bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, real quick, what are the injuries that she sustained as a result of the gunshot wound to her leg?
Yeah, this is what we refer to as a through and through gunshot wound, Jesse, where it passes through one location. It actually strikes bone, and not to mention the other soft tissue and the muscle and this sort of thing, and not to mention the vessels, and then exits. And so this is a devastating injury, depending upon the type of ammunition that was being fired in this weapon, which is unclear to me at this point in time. But needless to say, she was shot in the leg, and this bone winds up being fractured. I can only imagine the therapy, physical therapy, that this young lady, and surgeries that this young lady has had to endure.
Yeah, she said she has back problems. Her life is really not the same for multiple reasons, clearly, but from a physical standpoint, back problems, balance issues. It's just not the same. We'll talk more about her after this short break, and we are covering this Marine murder case. Stay tuned. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this with Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. Joseph, in your experience, is it common that you can have defendants who would have engaged in a crime 6 days before use something from that crime into the new crime? And what we're talking about here is using that handgun that they allegedly stole from one of the victims and then used it to kill a victim 6 days later. Do you see an overlap of crime scenes?
I'll give you a short answer.
No,
yes.
I'll take a... Okay, well, there. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I'm serious. Yeah, absolutely. And you will have items taken from other crimes that facilitate future crimes. I can give you examples of cases that I have personally worked where we had a guy that was renting weapons to local, ne'er-do-wells. They would go by a home, rent stolen weapons, take them out, perpetrate a crime, and bring it back. So yeah, I mean, it happens with great frequency.
Why does this happen, though? Don't they realize that maybe you shouldn't be using stuff from that crime scene, or am I thinking too much of them?
Yeah, they're not going to be professors at MIT anytime soon. So yeah, I think that you're giving them too much credit. They're living in a very visceral life. They're trying to satisfy their immediate needs, and many times that's why people commit strong-arm robberies. Going out and trying to snatch this poor woman's purse. Husband's going to take exception, and it's going to lead to this kind of event. But yeah, and again, I take exception with people that say, what is this defense attorney doing? The defense attorney is doing their job. They're trying to, keep a noose from around these guys' neck in the perpetration of this crime, and they're going to try to poke holes. And when we look at it, and it's good to have connectivity, all right, Jesse?
Yeah.
But when you have multiple crimes, it also convolutes the waters as well. When you're trying to work on another crime and you've got something else that has happened, a pre-existing crime that has happened, where you got this lineage that kind of goes down.
Well, let me ask you about that. Connecting the crimes. There were 3 victims in the motel robbery. None of them were shot. You go to this parking lot, 2 victims were shot. The fact that there is a difference, an armed conflict in both, but there were no shooting victims in the first, what does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that these 2 individuals that perpetrated the homicide were highly aggressive, very territorial, and they locked horns with a Marine, Jesse. And I got to tell you, that's not something you want to do. And plus, as you said, this guy's trying to defend his wife.
Right.
He doesn't know what this guy is taken. It's just taken completely aback. They're walking out of this bar, and this happens in this parking lot. So it's the nature of the individuals that are introduced into this kind of violent mix. The first case, you didn't have any gunplay that was involved in this thing. Second one, these guys are being disrespected. They perceive it this way. The guy's not going to knuckle under and just bend his knee to them and say, "Here, take everything I have." And in the end, they did actually take everything he had. They took his life.
They took his life, and they took him away from his wife. Now, the question is, were these the 2 people that did this? And we're going to let our viewers know what the jury ultimately decided. But when we come back, we are going to play for you the testimony of Shane Hansford, one of the victims from that motel robbery. You're not going to want to miss what he has to say. We'll be back after.
Here are today's top crime stories trending on lawandcrime.com and across the country. Video shows a Utah Transit Authority worker confronted 5 women on a train on their way to a concert. Camille Horner said she and another friend went to the bathroom together because only one of them had feminine hygiene products.
These women, we didn't say. What's wrong with that?
Why does it take all 3 of them 10 minutes?
Because
one person, are you putting them in each other?
Because we have. What the fuck is that? We're putting them in each other.
The train worker has been placed on leave and may lose his job. A waitress in Georgia absolutely devastated a man who grabbed her butt as he walked out of the restaurant. Incredible surveillance video shows Vinny Go-Go's employee, Amelia Holden, reacting with force when a yet-to-be-identified male apparently thought grabbing her butt was a good idea. Holden grabbed the man by the collar and tossed him like a rag doll. Police reviewed the surveillance footage and arrested the man. Those were today's top crime stories. I'm Anthony Velez for Law and Crime.
Wow. Wow. Can we get an applause? That was pretty incredible stuff. Pretty amazing. Good for her. Let's talk a little bit more about it with Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. Speaking of death, I'm surprised she didn't kill him, Joseph, and talking about this in a much different way.
Yeah, I'm surprised she didn't reach up and throat punch this guy as a result of his actions. Yeah, this can be categorized as a sexual assault, and I don't know if this guy. I don't know if he was inebriated or what was going on with this guy. He'd had, been doing too many 12-ounce curls in the bar prior to this, and he picked the wrong waitress, man. And you can imagine, she has to deal with this sort of thing probably with some frequency, maybe not to this degree, but she probably gets harassed on a regular basis.
No,
and she just had enough.
See the way that I see it, and I mentioned this before, she didn't even flinch a second. She knew exactly what happened. So I imagine this might have happened a lot more than we know. Yeah. And she even said, look, I don't want to relive this, don't tag me in this, I don't want to do any interviews, but you have to imagine, like you said, she's not only been harassed, but this has probably happened a lot more.
Yeah, I don't know who in the world would want this job, where you're having to, it's tough enough to wait tables, but then to have to put up with patrons that are going to put their filthy mitts on you at the same time, that's asking a bit much, and she had probably had enough. And I'm glad that she set her boundaries, man. I don't know how many people this is going to raise awareness on good touch, bad touch. But in this case, this guy's going to learn a lesson, and he's going to pay a hefty price for this, Jess.
Oh, yeah, he was charged with sexual battery. That's no joke.
No, it's not.
That is no joke, and it's all caught on tape. I wonder what his game plan was. What was he thinking? Did he look at the way that she's dressed and assume he could do that? I mean, and she made a point of that, just because I dress like that at work doesn't give anyone the right to do it, and she's 100% right. Every time we cover a case here, I always try to go into the minds of the defendants. As sick as it is, I try to understand what they're doing, and there are times I just can't figure it out. I don't understand, and I don't want to understand. This is one of those cases where I just don't understand what goes through someone's mind.
No, I can't understand it either. What would give you the idea that you just, you have the right to touch someone in a private area like this, and in full view of the public? The thing about it is it's not like he approached her and was just like engaging. This is some random guy that just walks up and puts his hand in this location that's completely inappropriate. And boy, did he pay a price for it. She took him down, which was actually, from my perspective, quite impressive.
Yeah, she didn't mess around. It was actually very impressive. Now, unfortunately, we can't talk more about this case. I would like to talk about it a little bit more, but we have to switch gears, and we have to get a little bit more back on track with the Marine murder case that we've been covering. Now, this case, we covered in its entirety. We played you before our last break the testimony of Megan Price, the surviving victim. She was shot in the leg. We played you her 911 phone call and her testimony where she describes how her husband was gunned down outside of that bar on her birthday. Really horrific stuff, and on her birthday nonetheless. But now I want to play you something really important. This is the testimony of Shane Hansford. He is one of the robbery victims, and it is alleged that the two defendants, Quincinio Cannon and Dewan Malazam, robbed 3 individuals from a motel 6 days before they allegedly killed Jonathan Price, and that they stole Shane Hansford's gun, and that was the same gun that they used to kill Jonathan Price. Let me play for you right now the testimony of Shane Hansford, that robbery victim. Take a look. That was a light moment in a rather real dark case where this man is describing Shane Hansford talking about being robbed at gunpoint, him and 2 other individuals. Really frightening stuff. Let's bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, how lucky are these 3 to be alive? I'm sure in your experience you have seen a lot of cases during robberies where people are gunned down.
Yeah, I have. They're just taken unawares. These folks are very lucky, very fortunate to still have their lives, and to lend critical testimony in this particular case. And a lot of the dynamic is going to depend upon how you react to individuals, and we've got kind of polar opposites here. These guys the fellow that's testifying in his group were rather submissive in this event. And then we go to the other end of the spectrum where this Marine, he wasn't having any of it, and you get a completely different outcome. So, yeah, and sometimes compliance does not necessarily equal safety. People will take it as that you're weak and they'll beat you down further. It all depends on what their end game is here. And just a tragic set of circumstances. I'm glad these people are still alive, though.
There's no right way to handle that situation. I hope no one is ever in that situation. But in your experience, when you see these people who are in traumatic events, we saw Megan Price testify, now we're seeing Shane Hansford testify, their ability to recall the specific details about who did this, do you find that most of the time it's a blur, or they do remember certain key details?
Yeah, they will remember, and as time goes by, and granted, again, I'm not a forensic psychologist, but I talk about briefly when I lecture at JSU about general, overall forensics. We talk about memory recall relative to eyewitness testimony, and we can go back in time all the way back to the studies that Dr. Stern did back at the turn of the last century, where he was talking about memory recall and how people are shown photographs that kind of shock them what they will remember. You can imagine in this dynamic situation, they'll remember bits and pieces, but it's almost like our brain has a layer. It begins to layer over a period of time to protect us from these traumatic events. And as time goes by, this is why it's so very critical for police to get out and begin to interview people early on from Jump Street, to conduct these interviews so you can collect as much real data as you possibly can, because as time goes by, memories fade, and also your brain just has a will to protect itself from these traumatic events that it's borne witness to.
And that is why it's amazing when we see so many of these cold cases now coming to fruition today, having witnesses talking about things that happened 30 years ago, 10 years ago. Unbelievable to watch. Now, we have a lot more to cover in this case, a lot more. We were going to play you some more of Shane Hansford's testimony, including some potential problems with the lineups that the defendants were in. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Pretty incredible stuff in this case, that you have the witnesses who survived these robberies and these attacks being able to testify in court. Let's bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, one of the things I didn't get a chance to ask you yet is the injuries sustained by Jonathan Price, the fatal gunshot wound. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what that wound was? I believe he died instantly, but can you explain it for our viewers a little bit more?
Yeah, he was shot in the back, Jesse, and this passed through the central vital area involving the heart and the lungs. People dance around and talk about instantaneous death. I think that we try to assuage families' fears and horror of the idea that it was an instantaneous death.
Yeah.
Those don't happen all of the time. I think that there probably would have been an awareness and a kind of a drifting away. And the way this dynamic kind of happens is that the blood pressure drops precipitously as you're bleeding out internally. I can imagine when, pardon me, when they did the autopsy, there was a tremendous amount of internal bleeding that had taken place, and he would have bled out. So there is an awareness, kind of a lingering awareness, what we call a perimortem state. This is the time just prior to death, and it's saddening. But she and the wife would have borne witness to this. We recall her begging and pleading for him to hang on, and telling him, she was telling him that she loves him. She knows that life is slipping away.
Did he hear that? Do you think he heard it?
I think that there may have been some kind of awareness to it. It's not like, where you have some kind of blistering head injury that automatically the lights go out. It just doesn't happen that way, and it doesn't happen like people think on television, where someone is shot and they automatically just succumb immediately. This is a single gunshot wound. There will still be some life that is left within the individual. Now, as to whether or not he could have hurt.
Joseph, it's interesting. You provide the reality of what we're doing here, and that's really what we do here on Law and Crime. We're showing the reality of this, and it's not pretty at times. So
no, it's not.
It's really not pretty. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. So that was the testimony of Shane Hansford, this robbery victim. I want to bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan to talk a little bit more about it. The idea of lineups, he picked out the defendants from lineup. In your experience, the reliability of that, able to pick people out from a traumatic event and pick them out of a lineup, what did you make of that piece of testimony?
Yeah, it can be troubling. You really run a risk with lineups many times. Just from a procedural standpoint, Jesse, for folks that don't know at home, these things are very well measured. It's something that the defense and the prosecution will take a very close look at from a procedural standpoint, how the police did this, and even the defense. This idea of reasonable doubt, was someone coached? Were they prodded in a particular direction? And again, they want to implant this into the mind of the jury as they're giving them either a live lineup, and I've seen, obviously picture, static photo lineups that have taken place over the years in cases I've been involved in. So it's something that's always a point of order, if you will, in court. And then you go to the human element of this. If you're talking about an eyewitness to a particular event, do they have sufficient faculty to recall details about this individual? We talked about, you could hear him talking about how all he could see was the guy was dark. He had his head was obscured, all these sorts of things. And again, this is playing into the hands of the defense here, because it raises the specter of reasonable doubt. And keep in mind what this guy has been through in this event. How much of this is actually implanted on their brains? I think a lot of people in the audience would probably say, "Oh man, well, if this happened to me, I would definitely remember every detail." The thing about it is the brain is a funny thing. It can actually kind of play tricks on you and rearrange the way things might have appeared in your perceived reality as opposed to the way they actually happened, or those people that were actually there.
And that's why they always say, after a case comes on the news, do you start filling in details? I get it. I get what's going on here. But I want to, the defense really picked up on Shane Hansford during their cross-examination. They weren't letting this guy go because they're claiming that their clients are completely innocent. Let's go to some of that cross-examination right now.
And you would have mentioned...
Okay. Defense poking some holes there. I'm here with Joseph Scott Morgan. So they're doing a pretty good job, I think, of saying, are you sure what you saw? You didn't report a lot of this. So you were talking about it before, about the ability to recall, the ability to change your perception. Is that what you're seeing that they're getting at right there?
Yeah, it is, Jesse. And it's not necessarily, and folks at home, please understand, this is not impugning the integrity of this guy. It's drawing into question his ability to remember these events subsequent to a very traumatic event, or just in the midst of a very traumatic event, and all this time later. And that's what defense is getting to here. They are attempting to question the validity of what he has seen, his ability to remember these things, and it plays to the passions of the jury. We have to keep in mind, we've got people's lives at stake here.
Joseph, you mentioned it earlier in the break. We have about a minute left. You talked about the ability to track the gun, how ATF played a big role in this case. Can you talk about that a little bit? We have about a minute.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize this. ATF is the foremost, law enforcement institution in our country that tracks weapons. And they have, for instance, one of the largest gang databases out there, gangs dealing guns. And we're talking about regular street-level gangs to biker gangs, this sort of thing. And so lost or stolen weapons, those things are entered into a database, and they have a tremendous ability to track weapons that show up, say, for instance, that have been stolen and have been reported. It'll pop up on their radar. And they alert local authorities saying, hey, you know, we've got a weapon that's been reported missing or stolen in your jurisdiction. What do you know about it? And so they play an integral part in local investigations as well.
And tracking this gun that was allegedly stolen from the robbery and then used in a murder 6 days later becomes critical. We'll talk more about the tracking of the gun in a minute. When we come back, we're going to talk about this, but we're also going to play you the testimony of Mitchell Smith. He is another one of the victims in that motel robbery. Gives a different account, or a little bit of his testimony is checked out a little bit differently. We'll be right back. Okay, Mitchell Smith has been one very interesting witness to follow, and you're going to see that a little bit more when he's grilled under cross-examination about his identification, because he had a Facebook post that put his entire credibility into question. But what did he just say? He said he directly points at Canada in the courtroom, says he's the guy who robbed me. He says Malazem, he recognizes now that he sees him as the guy that maybe did this. Now, I want to bring back in Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, I know we have to sign you off. So as you look at this case where you have two different events that are connected and trying to pinpoint these guys, how does it stand out for you as a case that is different from other ones you've seen?
Well, I think, you know, we always go back in forensics to connectivity, you know, placing things together, and this kind of illustrates it in a macro way, where we have two seemingly dissimilar cases. You know, who would have known 6 days prior to this that this would have wound up in the tragedy that it became? But it's interesting how all of this fits together.
And Joseph, that's really it. How it all fits together is pretty incredible. Sorry I have to cut you off. Joseph, it was so great having you on. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you guys.
All right, everybody. We're going to cover more of this right after this short break. Stay tuned.